Hey guys, tonight we begin with something slow, quiet and devastating. A story not of swords or cannons, but of smoke. A thin, sweet-smelling smoke that curled through the windows of palaces and into the lungs of peasants, that drifted through government halls and into the hands of merchants that whispered promises of peace and delivered only ruin. We're talking about opium, and we're talking about how it didn't just weaken one of the most powerful empires on earth. It hollowed it out from the inside like something eating the wood of a great tree until the whole thing finally fell in silence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early 1700s, the Qing Dynasty sat at the top of the world, literally. China controlled more land, more people, and more wealth than perhaps any empire in human history. The Qing emperors ruled over 300 million people. Their granaries were full, their armies were vast. Their silks and porcelain and tea were the most coveted goods on earth, and every merchant in Europe and beyond would sail half the globe just to get their hands on them. The dynasty called itself Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization, the place around which everything else revolved. And honestly, if you were standing in Beijing in the year 1750 looking out at the gleaming rooftops of the Forbidden City, at the broad avenues and the crowded markets and the temple smoke rising in the morning air, you might have believed it. The Qing dynasty was a machine, complex, ancient and seemingly unstoppable, but machines have weak points. And empires, no matter how magnificent they look from the outside, can be undone by things so small you'd almost miss them. Like a pipe, like a poppy, like a thin ribbon of smoke rising from a clay bowl in the back room of a tea house, drifting up past the paper lanterns and out into the night. The story of how opium destroyed the Qing dynasty is not a story of one dramatic battle or a single catastrophic decision. It's slower than that. It's quieter than that. It's a story that took over a century to fully unfold, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already far too late. And it all started, as so many catastrophes do, with someone trying to make money. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Something about knowing there are people all over the world winding down to stories like this one makes these long, slow journeys feel a little less lonely. The poppy plant had been known in China for centuries. Doctors used it. Travellers brought it along the Silk Road. In small quantities, mixed with other medicines, it dulled, pain settled. Upset stomachs helped the elderly sleep through cold winters. Nobody panicked about it. It was a tool like many tools, useful in the right hands and for the right purpose. But then something changed. Sometime in the late 1600s, smoking tobacco mixed with opium began spreading through parts of Southeast Asia, and the habit drifted north and east into China's coastal provinces. Sailors brought it. Traders carried it. It moved quietly through port towns like Guangzhou and Fuzhou, passed hand to hand without ceremony or alarm. By the early 1700s, the Qing government noticed, and they did what governments almost always do when they notice something new and alarming. They banned it. Emperor Yongzheng issued an edict in 1729 prohibiting the smoking of opium and the operation of opium dens. The punishment for selling it was severe. The punishment for running an opium den was worse. Yongzheng understood even then that this was not an ordinary habit. He could see what it did to the men who indulged in it too freely, the way they stopped caring about their work, the way they stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping properly, stopped being reliable. He had seen enough to know that whatever this thing was, it needed to be stopped before it took root. And for a while the ban held, mostly because the thing about banning a substance is that it rarely makes the desire for it disappear. It just makes the desire go underground, and underground is exactly where it went. At roughly the same time that China was trying to suppress opium, the British East India Company was trying to solve a very different kind of problem. The company wanted Chinese goods desperately. Tea above all else, because by the mid-1700s, Britain had become a nation of tea drinkers in a way that bordered on the fanatical. You have to understand what tea meant to Britain at that time. It was not just a beverage. It was a ritual, a social institution, a daily necessity for everyone from duchesses to dock workers. And all of it, every single leaf, came from China. The problem was that China did not particularly want anything Britain had to offer in return. The Qing emperors had made this abundantly clear. When King George III sent a formal diplomatic mission to China in 1793, the Qianlong emperor sent back a letter that has become one of history's most politely devastating rejections. He told the British king in essence that China already had everything it needed, that it had no use for foreign goods or foreign ideas, and that Britain was welcome to continue trading at the approved port in Guangzhou under the existing rules. Thank you very much. Goodbye. The British had to pay for tea and silver. Rivers of silver flowing east year after year. The trade deficit was enormous and growing. And somewhere in the accounting offices of the East India Company, men in powdered wigs looked at the numbers and began looking for a solution. And the solution, when it occurred to them, was elegant in the coldest possible way. If China wouldn't buy British goods, maybe China could be made to need something else. Something the company already had in abundance. Something grown in the poppy fields of Bengal, processed in company warehouses in Patna and packed into 40-pound chests ready for shipping. Opium, not medicine, not tradition, just product manufactured at scale and aimed at an empire. Let me know in the comments if you'd heard about this part of history before. I always wonder how much of this actually gets taught in schools. The mechanics of the opium trade were carefully constructed to give the British government what it needed most in those early years, which was deniability. The East India Company held a monopoly on opium production in Bengal. They grew the poppies, processed the resin, and auctioned the finished product in Calcutta to independent merchants. Those merchants then sailed to the Chinese coast with their cargo technically on their own initiative. The company was simply the producer. It didn't ship the drug to China itself, it just made the drug and sold it to people who did. This allowed British officials to maintain with a straight face that they were not directly involved in an illegal trade. They were simply selling a legal agricultural product within the boundaries of their own territory. What happened to it afterward was strictly speaking not their concern. And what happened to it afterward was this. The independent merchants, mostly British and Indian, but occasionally American, sailed to the Pearl River estuary off the southern coast of China. They anchored their ships just outside Chinese waters and waited. Chinese smugglers came to them in fast, shallow boats under cover of darkness, exchanging silver for chests of opium. The drugs were then carried up the river networks and distributed across an empire that had no idea yet how deeply it was about to be penetrated. Chinese customs officials knew, local authorities knew. Many of them were paid to look away, and the ones who refused were sometimes simply outmaneuvered. The coastline was impossibly long, the river networks impossibly complex. And the profit margins were extraordinary, which meant that for every official who tried to stop the trade, there were a dozen local players with every financial incentive to keep it moving. By the 1800s, the numbers had become almost incomprehensible. In 1729, when the first prohibition was issued, a few hundred chests of opium entered China annually. By 1800, that number had risen to around 4,000 chests. By 1820, it was closer to 15,000. By 1838, on the eve of what history would call the Opium Wars, more than 40,000 chests of opium were flooding into China every single year. Each chest contained roughly 40 kilograms of the drug. Each kilogram, when processed and smoked, could sustain a habitual user for weeks. Do the math on those numbers and what you find is not a trade. What you find is a systematic, industrial, extraordinarily profitable effort to addict an entire civilization. And it was working. Because here is what opium does to a person. And I want you to understand this, really understand it, before we talk about what it did to an empire. Opium, when smoked, produces a sensation that survivors and historians have described again and again with the same language. Relief. A melting away of pain, of anxiety, of the weight of a hard life. For a peasant working himself to exhaustion in the fields, or a soldier marching through brutal winters, or a merchant drowning in debt, the first experience of opium could feel like finding a door in a wall you didn't know existed. A door that opened into warmth and softness, and a profound sense that everything just for a little while was going to be all right. And then the door closed, and the next morning nothing was all right at all. In fact, everything was worse. The pain came back harder, the anxiety returned sharper. The weight of daily life felt heavier than it had before, as if the body, having tasted relief, now resented the absence of it with a fury it hadn't known before. And the only solution, the only thing that worked, was the pipe. Just one more time. Just to get through this day, just tonight. And then tomorrow, surely tomorrow you would stop, but you didn't stop, because by the time you were making that promise to yourself, your body had already stopped believing you. If you're still with me, drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you are. I love picturing all of you out there in different time zones, different corners of the world, winding down to the same story. By the 1830s, opium addiction had penetrated every layer of Qing society. And when I say every layer, I mean every layer. Not just the poor, not just the desperate. The soldiers who were supposed to guard the empire's borders were smoking opium in their barracks. The clerks and administrators who were supposed to run the vast machinery of government were spending their evenings in opium dens and their mornings too groggy to function. There were credible reports of provincial governors maintaining personal opium habits, of eunuchs in the imperial court trading opium behind closed doors, of scholars who had passed the grueling imperial examinations and earned prestigious positions in the bureaucracy now spending their government salaries on drug shipments. Some estimates from the period suggest that somewhere between 4 and 12 million people were addicted to opium by the late 1830s. Conservative estimates, the real number may have been far higher, and the consequences rippled outward in every direction. Tax collection collapsed in provinces where administrators were too impaired to function. Military readiness deteriorated as soldiers became unreliable, slow, and incapable of the discipline that effective combat required. The silver that had once flowed into China from foreign trade was now flowing out in a reverse current, draining into the pockets of British merchants and company shareholders half a world away. The Qing government had spent decades running a trade surplus. Now they were watching their silver reserves empty with alarming speed. Prices rose. Peasants who paid their taxes in copper coins found that the exchange rate between copper and silver had swung against them, meaning their effective tax burden had increased without any new laws being passed. The empire was bleeding from a wound it could barely see, let alone treat. The man who finally forced China to confront this crisis directly was a Qing official named Lin Zexu. And if you've never heard of him before, you should have, because what he did in 1839 was one of the most extraordinary acts of principled defiance in modern history, and it ultimately triggered a catastrophe he could not have prevented by the time he understood what he was up against. Lin Zexu was appointed as imperial commissioner and sent to Guangzhou, the main port through which the opium trade flowed, with a mandate from the Daoguang emperor to end the trade once and for all. Lin was not a naive man. He understood that this would not be simple. He wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria herself, a letter that historians still read today, asking her to consider the damage that British merchants were doing to the Chinese people. He pointed out with considerable restraint under the circumstances that Britain would not permit its own citizens to be flooded with dangerous drugs, and that the same courtesy ought to be extended to China. He received no reply, so Lin Zexu did what he had come to do. He demanded that foreign merchants surrender all of their opium stocks immediately. When they hesitated, he surrounded the foreign trading quarter with troops and cut off its food supply. After a tense standoff, the merchants capitulated. 20,000 chests of opium, more than 1,000 tons of the drug were handed over, and Lin Zexu had it destroyed. Not hidden, not confiscated for government use, destroyed. His workers spent 23 days dissolving the opium in trenches filled with water, salt and lime before flushing it out to sea. He reportedly stood and watched, and then wrote a formal apology to the sea god for polluting the waters. The gesture was both practical and deeply symbolic. This was a man who understood what he was doing and why it mattered. And in London, when the news arrived, the reaction was immediate and furious. And here is where the story takes a turn that ought to make you pause, because what happened next was not justice. It was not inevitable. It was a choice, a deliberate, debated, narrowly approved choice made by the British Parliament to go to war with China over the right to sell it drugs. The debate in Parliament was not unanimous. Some members spoke passionately against it. The young William Gladstone, who would later become one of Britain's greatest prime ministers, stood in the House of Commons and asked whether it was possible to imagine a war more unjust in its origins, or more calculated to cover this country with permanent disgrace. He was outvoted. The British government sent warships, and this is the moment when the gap between what China believed about itself and what was actually true became impossible to ignore. Now would be a wonderful moment to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories take a long time to research and craft, and your support genuinely makes this possible. Subscribe if the slow unravelling of something once magnificent is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, which being here I suspect it might be. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842, and it was not a contest. This is the part that is hardest to explain without sounding cruel, but history does not soften its edges to spare our feelings. The Qing military in 1839 was operating with weapons, tactics and organisational structures that had not substantially changed in nearly 2 centuries. Their most powerful warships were wooden junks armed with cannon that had been state-of-the-art in the 1600s. Their soldiers carried matchlock muskets and pikes alongside more modern equipment, but training was inconsistent and supply chains were unreliable. Some garrisons had not received proper equipment in years. Others had been so thoroughly corrupted by the general decline of institutional function that readiness was almost a theoretical concept. The British arrived with steam-powered warships, iron-hulled, shallow-drafted vessels that could sail upriver regardless of wind, impervious to the kind of fire that would have deterred traditional naval engagements. Their guns had a range and accuracy that Chinese artillerymen could not match. Their troops were disciplined, well-supplied, and operating with clear command structures. The engagements were horrific and brief. Chinese soldiers fought with genuine bravery, in many cases understanding what was at stake. But bravery is not a substitute for technology, and courage cannot close the gap between a smoothbore cannon and a modern artillery piece. Fort after fort fell, city after city was threatened. The Qing government, watching its defences crumble with a speed that must have felt almost dreamlike, did what it could not afford to do but could not see how to avoid. It sued for peace. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, was China's first major treaty with a Western power, and it set the template for what historians now call the Century of Humiliation. China was required to pay an enormous indemnity of 21 million silver dollars to Britain, partly to compensate merchants for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed, which meant that China paid Britain for the privilege of having had its citizens addicted. Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports were opened to British trade on terms that China did not choose. British citizens in China were granted extraterritoriality, meaning they could not be tried under Chinese law for crimes committed on Chinese soil. They answered to their own courts. They existed, legally speaking, in a bubble. The Qing courts signed. And somewhere in the empire, hundreds of thousands of pipes continued to smoke because the treaty said nothing whatsoever about opium. The drug trade was simply legalized in 1858 after the Second Opium War made resistance seem even more pointless than before. The British got what they wanted. The opium kept coming. Tell me in the comments what you're thinking right now. These long stretches of history tend to settle on you differently when it's quiet and late. I'm curious what part of this has stayed with you. In the aftermath of the First Opium War, something shifted in China that is difficult to name precisely but impossible to miss if you're paying attention to the historical record. It was something like a crack in the foundation of the empire's self-understanding. The Qing dynasty had ruled for 2 centuries on the premise accepted by nearly everyone within its borders, that China was the centre of civilization, that its systems of governance and philosophy and social order represented the peak of what human society could achieve. The emperor was the son of heaven. The mandate of heaven justified his rule. The bureaucracy, selected through one of the most rigorous examination systems ever devised, administered an empire of staggering complexity with considerable effectiveness. And none of these things were simply propaganda, they had been real. The achievements of Chinese civilization were genuine and remarkable. But now the mandate of heaven had been humiliated by men in red coats who sailed iron ships and wanted to sell drugs. And the empire did not know how to hold both things in its mind at once. The response of the Qing court to this dilemma was in retrospect tragically inadequate. There were officials who understood what had happened, who argued clearly that China needed to modernize its military technology, rethink its foreign policy, and engage seriously with the outside world on its own terms rather than simply hoping it would go away. But these voices were in the minority. The dominant response was to explain away the defeat as the result of specific tactical failures, bad geography, inadequate preparation, the particular viciousness of the barbarians in question, and to return as much as possible to the way things had been. This was not stupidity. It was the weight of a civilization that had been right about almost everything for a very long time, suddenly needing to be wrong about something fundamental and finding that it did not know how. And then into this cracked and uncertain empire with its draining silver and its smoking dens and its humiliating treaties came the Taiping Rebellion. And if the opium trade was the slow poison, the Taiping Rebellion was the fever that nearly killed the patient outright before the poison could finish its work. The Taiping Rebellion began in 1850 and lasted until 1864. In that time it killed somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. Some estimates go higher. It remains one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and most people in the Western world have never heard of it. The rebellion was led by a man named Hong Xiuquan, who had failed the imperial examinations multiple times and experienced a series of visions that he came to interpret after reading a Christian missionary pamphlet as evidence that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He was charismatic, driven, and catastrophically wrong about almost everything he believed, but he attracted followers by the millions, primarily from among the poor, the displaced, and the desperate, all of whom had excellent reasons to be furious at the existing order of things. And among the most furious of all were the people whose lives had been most thoroughly destroyed by opium. Hong Xiuquan banned opium absolutely within Taiping-controlled territory. It was one of the genuine moral convictions of the movement. And the energy that Ban released in communities that had been half-drowning in addiction for a generation was real. The Taiping forces were disciplined in ways the Qing armies increasingly were not. They took Nanjing in 1853 and held it for more than a decade. The Qing dynasty nearly fell. The empire that had stood for 2 centuries came within genuine distance of being dismantled by a rebellion led by a man who believed he was the son of God. It survived, but survival in this case is a word that needs to be handled carefully. The Qing armies that eventually crushed the Taiping Rebellion did so with significant foreign assistance and at a cost that further accelerated the empire's decline. The tax base of the most productive provinces had been devastated. The population of the Yangtze River Valley The agricultural heartland had been catastrophically reduced. The bureaucracy, already undermined by corruption and addiction, had been further hollowed out by a decade of war, and through all of it, the opium trade continued. If anything, the chaos of the rebellion opened new channels and created new demand. Soldiers who needed relief from the horror of what they were seeing and doing. Refugees who needed something, anything, to make the present moment survivable. Dealers who followed the armies and the displaced populations with their supply chains intact. It is one of the darkest patterns in this story. Every crisis created more demand, and more demand created more supply, and more supply created more crisis. Stay with me because this part of the story goes somewhere you might not expect, and I don't want you to miss it. By the 1860s and 1870s, the Qing Dynasty was attempting what historians call the self-strengthening movement, a genuine, serious, deeply limited effort to modernize China's military and industrial capacity without fundamentally changing the political and social structures that had produced the current disaster. The men who led this movement were not fools. Li Hongjiang, who was its most prominent figure, was one of the most capable officials of the era. They built shipyards, they established arsenals, they created new schools that taught Western science alongside classical Chinese learning. They sent students abroad, they built railways, though slowly and with enormous political resistance. They tried. They genuinely tried. But they were trying to modernize the hardware of a civilization while leaving the software completely unchanged. The imperial examination system still tested candidates primarily on their knowledge of classical Confucian texts. The political structure still concentrated power in ways that made rapid decision-making almost impossible. The bureaucracy still suffered from the corruption that a century of institutional decay and opium money had produced. And the fundamental assumption that China's problems were essentially technical rather than systemic remained in place, which meant that the reforms never went deep enough to address what was actually wrong. Meanwhile, opium production had spread within China itself. The empire had been importing the drug for a century, and now, in a grim kind of import substitution, Chinese farmers in Yunnan, Sichuan, and other provinces began growing poppies for domestic consumption. In some regions, the local economy had reorganized itself around opium cultivation to a degree that made reform almost unthinkable without catastrophic economic disruption. Landlords who grew poppies were doing better than those who grew grain in many areas. Officials who taxed the local opium trade were funding provincial government services with those revenues. The drug had become infrastructure. It had become part of the metabolism of the empire in ways that went far beyond individual addiction. It wasn't just in people's bodies, it was in the budget. And then came 1894, and the war with Japan that shattered what remained of the self-strengthening movement's credibility. Japan had begun its own modernization process in 1868, the Meiji Restoration, and had done it completely differently. Rather than attempting to modernize selectively while preserving existing structures, Japan had restructured almost everything. Its military, its legal system, its industrial base, its educational institutions, its political structures, all of it rebuilt from the ground up in roughly 3 decades. When Japan and China went to war over influence in Korea in 1894, the result was not even a genuine contest. The Qing armies, despite all the arsenals and shipyards of the self-strengthening period, were defeated decisively. The Beiyang fleet, the pride of China's naval modernization, was destroyed. The Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed in 1895, and it was another humiliation. China ceded Taiwan and the Pescadores to Japan. It paid another enormous indemnity. It recognized Korea's independence from Chinese influence, which meant the end of a tributary relationship that had existed for centuries, and perhaps most symbolically devastating of all, it had been defeated not by Britain or France, or any of the distant Western powers that had traditionally been viewed as alien and incomprehensible. It had been defeated by Japan, a country that the Qing court had historically regarded as a junior civilization, a student of Chinese culture. That was the wound that would not close. Take a breath, you're doing well. This is the long part of the night where history really starts to settle in. The humiliation of 1895 produced in response the 100 Days Reform of 1898. The young Guangxu emperor, supported by a group of reformist scholars, including the extraordinary Kang Yuwei, attempted to implement sweeping modernizing changes across virtually every institution of Qing governance in roughly 100 days. The reforms were breathtaking in their ambition. Restructure the military, reform the examination system, establish a constitutional monarchy, modernize education, encourage industry, open government to new ideas and new people. Had they been implemented and had time to take root, they might have given the dynasty a genuine chance at survival. They lasted approximately 103 days before the Empress Dowager Cixi, who had effectively ruled China for decades from behind the throne, staged a coup. The Guangxu emperor was placed under house arrest on an island in the Zhongnanhai. He would remain there until he died one day before Cixi herself in 1908, under circumstances that have never been definitively explained. The reformist scholars were executed or fled. The reforms were reversed. Cixi restored the old order with a thoroughness that suggested she genuinely did not understand or could not afford to understand that the old order was the problem. And here is where the opium enters the story again in a way that is not metaphorical, but almost insultingly literal. Cixi herself was in her later years reportedly an opium user. So were significant numbers of the officials around her. The court that overturned the reforms and condemned the dynasty to its remaining years of decline was a court in which addiction was not an aberration but a commonplace, in which the substance that had been eating the empire for a century had made it all the way to the innermost circles of power. The smoke that had started in the tea-houses of Guangzhou had found its way at last into the Forbidden City. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 was the last great convulsion before the end, a violent, desperate, ultimately disastrous uprising led by a secret society called the Yehekwan, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, who believed that their martial arts training made them immune to bullets and that China's problems could be solved by killing foreigners and destroying foreign influence. They killed missionaries, attacked Chinese Christians, and besieged the foreign legation quarter in Beijing for 55 days. Cixi, in one of the most catastrophically miscalculated decisions of the era, declared war on the foreign powers and threw the imperial government's support behind the Boxers. The response was the Eight-Nation Alliance, a combined force from Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Japan, Russia, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, which marched on Beijing and lifted the siege. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 that followed imposed the largest indemnity in Chinese history, nearly 500 million silver taels to be paid with interest over 39 years. It was a sum so vast that it consumed a significant percentage of China's annual revenue for the next 4 decades. The foreign powers were granted the right to station troops in Beijing itself. China's sovereignty had been eroded to the point where its capital was effectively occupied by forces it had no ability to expel, and through the years of negotiation and humiliation and payment, the opium dens remained open. The poppy fields continued to grow, the silver continued to flow, because the empire no longer had the institutional coherence or the political will to address a crisis that had been building for over 100 years, and because addressing it now would have required dismantling economic structures that much of what remained of provincial governance depended on to function at all. There is something almost unbearable about this part of the story if you let yourself sit with it. Here was an empire of 300 million people. Here was a civilization of astonishing depth and beauty and intelligence. Here were scholars who had mapped the heavens and engineers who had built the Great Wall, and poets who had written about the human condition with a clarity that still resonates 1,000 years later. And it was being eaten alive slowly and systematically by addiction and corruption and the weight of its own inability to see itself clearly. Not because its people were weak, not because its culture was inferior, but because power, when it goes unquestioned for long enough, stops being able to see the walls that are closing in, and because someone somewhere had decided that making money was more important than the lives of millions of people they had never met and preferred not to think about. The Qing Dynasty ended in 1912 when the last emperor, a 6-year-old child named Puyi, was forced to abdicate following the Xinhai Revolution. He sat on the dragon throne for 3 years and 3 months, most of it, as a figurehead for a dynasty that had already ceased to function as a real government. He signed the abdication document with one hopes no awareness of what it meant and was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City for another decade before being eventually expelled. The dynasty that had ruled China for 268 years ended with a child's signature on a piece of paper. The republic that replaced it would spend the next 37 years in nearly continuous war, first against warlords, then against Japan, then in civil war between the nationalists and the communists before the People's Republic was established in 1949. And one of the very first things the new government did, with a speed and determination that spoke to how central the issue remained, was launch an aggressive campaign to eradicate opium from Chinese society once and for all. It took years and the methods were brutal, but by the mid-1950s a drug habit that had infected and debilitated Chinese society for over a century had been largely suppressed. The smoke had finally cleared. What it left behind was visible for a long time afterward in the shape of the landscape it had moved through. If this story has settled into you at all, leave me a comment. I read them, I genuinely do. The question that historians argue about, and that seems worth spending a moment on before we close, is how much of the Qing dynasty's fall was specifically about opium, and how much would have happened anyway. Because the forces arrayed against the Qing in the 19th century were enormous and would have tested any government. The Industrial Revolution had given European powers technological advantages that did not depend on opium to be effective. The Meiji Restoration in Japan would have created a rival power regardless of what was happening in Chinese ports. The internal stresses of governing an empire of that size without modern communication or transportation infrastructure would have created challenges even in a healthy administration. All of this is true. But here is what is also true. The opium trade specifically and systematically drained China of silver at the moment when silver was critical for government finance. It specifically and systematically degraded the military capacity of an empire that needed every advantage it could muster. It specifically and systematically corrupted the administrative apparatus that was supposed to respond to crisis. It created conditions in which reform was harder and resistance was weaker, and decision-making was slower and more compromised at every level. It did not create all of China's problems in the 19th century, but it made every single one of those problems worse. And it did so by design, because that was what it was for. The British government, to its eventual credit, did express some official discomfort about the trade as the 19th century wore on. There were parliamentary debates. There were missionaries and reformers who objected loudly and persistently. The trade was officially ended in 1907 by mutual agreement between Britain and China, with British merchants phasing out Indian opium exports over a decade as China simultaneously worked to reduce domestic production. But by 1907, the Qing Dynasty had 14 years left, and most of the damage had been done decades earlier. The apology, such as it was, arrived after the house had already burned. And what do you do with a story like that, with something that large and that deliberate and that long? The answer, I think, is that you hold it. You don't look away from it. You don't smooth it over with comfortable conclusions or easy morals. You just let it be what it is. A reminder that the largest catastrophes are sometimes made of the smallest decisions repeated thousands of times by thousands of people who each told themselves that their particular role in the thing was small enough, or removed enough, or profitable enough to justify. The merchant who sailed from Calcutta told himself he was just fulfilling a contract. The official who looked away at the harbour told himself he needed the bribe to feed his family. The company director in London told himself that the Chinese were making their own choices, and somewhere in all of that ordinary human rationalising, millions of lives went sideways. Millions of pipes were lit. Millions of families were hollowed out. An empire fell. Not because of an earthquake or a plague or a foreign army, because of smoke. Tonight, if you can appreciate the particular quiet of wherever you are right now, the clean air, the absence of a certain kind of desperation, these things are not guaranteed. They were not for a very long time available to a very large portion of humanity. And some of the people who ensured they were unavailable slept perfectly well in very comfortable beds and were by all accounts quite pleasant at dinner parties. Sleep well if you can. And when you're back, there are more long, slow, carefully researched stories waiting for you here. History has no shortage of things that look one way from a distance and another way entirely up close. Subscribe if you want to keep looking, and thank you genuinely for spending this piece of the night with me. It means more than you know.